has said no to rewiring the nation. And the biggest sign that they have become the nattering nabobs of negativity is their break with business over climate policy. While the Australian Industry Group and the Business Council of Australia are celebrating the safeguard mechanism passing Parliament, the Coalition are in here voting against the safeguards mechanism, voting against a measure that is the largest single carbon abatement measure that the government is pursuing, voting against a measure that provides certainty to industry, voting against a measure designed by Tony Abbott and Greg Hunt. The Coalition have become so much the party of no that they are today saying no to their own measures. There is a thing, Deputy Speaker, called the useless box, whose only job, when you switch it on, is to switch itself off again. And that is the very definition of the modern Liberal Party. They are the useless box of Australian politics. They have become the party that are Liberals in name only. They are the Lino Party. Now, Lino was a great floor covering in the 1950s, and that is the modern Liberal Party today, a party stuck in the past, a party mired in negativism. No wonder former Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull spends so much time criticising them. And those on that side grumble about expelling Malcolm Turnbull from the Liberal Party. They say Malcolm Turnbull isn't a real Liberal. What they don't realise is that they are the ones who have ceased being true Liberals. Now, all political parties lose their way from time to time. Mine was once headed by Billy Hughes, once headed by Mark Latham. But when you're in a hole, the least you can do is stop digging. The Trumpification of Robert Menzies' former party is truly sad. They think that their way back to the centre is listening to the Sky After Dark crowd. Now, I know some of those on my side of the House will be telling me I shouldn't be giving helpful advice to our political opponents. I shouldn't be reminding them that the way to win elections is from the centre of Australian politics. But I'm not worried by that. This is a party which has lost federal seats once held by Julie Bishop, Peter Costello, Joe Hockey, Josh Frydenberg, Malcolm Turnbull and Robert Menzies, and still comes in here rejecting the need for climate action, voting against their very own safeguard mechanism. This is a party who in Victoria has just seen its leader rolled in his attempt to expel one of their MPs who attended an anti-trans rally that included black-shirted members of the far right performing Nazi salutes on the steps of the Victorian Parliament. And in being rolled, the Victorian Liberal leader was being lobbied by members of the Federal Liberal Party, urging to keep that member in the party. The MPI is apparently about affordable housing, although the Shadow Treasurer didn't seem to display much concern for the issue in his remarks earlier. Their concern over housing is as genuine as a fox crying tears for the well-being of the chickens. This is the party that cut social housing programs. This is a party that allowed the home ownership rate to fall to its lowest level in half a century. The Coalition purport to be caring about inflation, a concern that's as genuine as a $3 note, because the single quarter of highest inflation this century was March 2022, when the Coalition were in office. Interest rate rises began under the Coalition, and indeed the opposition leader said at the time, quote, "Nobody wants to see interest rates go up, but it's a reality of a world where there's inflation." Those opposite claim that they're the party of lower taxes, but the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison governments were the second highest taxing governments since Federation, behind only the Howard government. They came into office in 2013, promising that they would deliver a budget surplus each and every year. By the time their last intergenerational report came down, it was projecting deficits all the way out until 2060. They're the party that say they are the safe custodians of taxpayer monies, and yet they gave $20 billion of JobKeeper to firms with rising revenue. We supported measures that saved jobs, but giving JobKeeper to Harvey Norman, AP Eagers and to offshore billionaires did not save a single job. This weekend, the voters of Aston will cast their ballots. We know, of course, that no government has taken a seat from the opposition in a by-election since 1920. We know the seat of Aston has been held by the Liberal Party since 1990. But I have a simple message for the voters of Aston. The Liberal Party has abandoned you. It's time to abandon the Liberal Party.
Member for Riverina.
Troy, where Brad Pitt playing Achilles says to a young kid who asked him why he wanted to go and fight this huge giant, he says, "But no one will remember your name." We do remember Billy Hughes' name, and I can't believe that the member for Fenner has disparaged a former Labor luminary. But I'm going to stand here and I'm going to stick up for Billy Hughes, because Billy Hughes, known as the Little Digger, he stood up for not only those who were in the army in World War I, he stood up for Australians at the Treaty of Versailles, and he stood up for ex-servicemen. I'm going to stand up, and member for Fenner, as much as I've got a lot of respect for you, you're probably like the kid in Troy. Will they remember your name? They certainly remember Billy Hughes' name. And when you go on about the Liberal Party and having something that nobody wants to buy, I just might remember you. I might recall the figures and might put them on the Hansard. First preference vote in the 2022 election, ALP 4,776,030, LNP 5,233,334. First preference votes, ALP 32.58%, LNP 35.7%. So on both scores, on both accounts, and we can make statistics what they are, but they're pretty stark. They are pretty stark. So I wouldn't go on too much, because your Achilles heel sits right over there. And whilst you might talk about the Teals and talk about the Greens, it's the Greens who are going to take your seats, my friend. And when you start doing dodgy deals and the Greens go out there and do press conferences about what they've achieved and the dirty deals that they've done, because what you're doing is you're sending all the emissions offshore, as the member for Fairfax quite correctly pointed out. I'd hate to be in the concrete industry, because that is going to be so much more expensive to get concrete, and indeed farming. Cost of living is just going through the roof, but whilst the member for Fenner was on his feet, I didn't hear him talk about the bread and butter issues too much in his matter of public importance contribution. He didn't talk about those issues which are affecting Mr and Mrs Average, because they're out there, they're wondering how they're going to pay for things. But don't take my word for it. The Salvation Army's Doorways Program Coordinator in Wagga Wagga, Jen Cameron, said since January 2 this year, the number of people who have asked for help due to high financial expenses and inadequate income has increased by 25%. People are saying they've never received help before, they've never asked for it, she told the Daily Advertiser. Comments, she said, are really concerning from the people who they're trying to help. Unless we see a dire change to the cost of living in the future, it's going to rise. She talked about the phenomenal, her word, amount of calls asking about payment assistance vouchers. She's worried that electricity prices rising by 20% in July is going to have a very harmful effect on those people who the member for Fenner and his cohorts opposite should be talking about and doing something for every day of the week. Instead of coming in here and disparaging Billy Hughes, instead of coming in here and disparaging the modern Liberal Party, instead of coming in here and quoting Robert Menzies perhaps out of tune or out of context, he should be looking after the forgotten people. And the forgotten people are those people outside this area who probably aren't aren't even listening to this debate. Why would they? Because they are getting on with the job of picking their kids up from school, kids who they probably won't be able to now take to sport or dancing or those sorts of things because they can't afford to. They're probably going to the grocery shops, but they're not going to have as big a hamper, they're not going to have as much at the checkout because they can't afford to. They're not going to have that meal out. They're going to be worried about how they're going to pay for their electricity prices. They're worried about how they're going to pay for their mortgages which were once this high and now they're this high. And indeed, it's going to be so difficult. Those rising mortgage interest rates, that rising amount of money that they have to find to pay for it, to pay for everyday ordinary items that they shouldn't have to worry about. And the excuses can't keep coming. You've been in government 10 months, Labor. God help us if they are in government 10 years. They've been in government for 10 months. The time for excuses and the blame game is over. Do your job. Do the job that you were elected to do, not by that many Australians. Make sure that the cost of living comes down.
Order.
So disorderly.
Order. It being the member for Solomon can resume his seat. It being 4:30, almost 4:30, I propose the question that the House do now adjourn and give the call to the honourable member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to call the Chamber's attention to the issue of heart failure. Heart failure affects more than 400,000 Australians and contributes to 61,000 deaths per year. It accounts for 70,000 hospital admissions per year. Tragically, those in rural areas and Indigenous Australians bear a disproportionate burden of heart failure. Data released from the Heart Foundation shows that death from heart disease is 60% higher in rural and remote areas of Australia compared to metropolitan areas. Hospitalisations in regional areas due to heart attack are double metropolitan rates, and hospitalisations due to heart failure are 90% higher. Any premature death is a tragedy, but in regional communities, the loss of a young heart failure victim is both tragic and shocking. People like Scott Umbeck. On Australia Day in 2019, Scott, the picture of health and fitness and father of 2 young boys, lost his life at 42 years of age to an undiagnosed and completely unexpected heart condition. He was a leader in the Mildura community and the husband of Katrina, who has devoted herself to promoting heart health and advocating for the establishment of new cardiac service in Mildura, where she lives. I have the utmost respect for Katrina, who is a shining example for her children and her community. Katrina is calling attention to the service gap in our region. Scott was never offered an angiogram, which could have diagnosed his condition and potentially saved his life. The reason? The service is not available in Mildura. It is still not available. His only option would have been to travel nearly 600 kilometres to Melbourne for a procedure he was unaware he needed. An angiogram could have diagnosed Scott's heart condition. Ensuring access to high-quality healthcare in regional and rural areas has always been and will continue to be a priority for me. It's something that I, as Shadow Assistant Minister for Regional Health, focus heavily on every day. The regions deserve equitable access to healthcare. This includes access to facilities such as a catheterisation laboratory, or cath lab, which would prevent so many needless deaths through procedures which have become less invasive over time. It should be a basic human right for those who live in regional communities to be able to access angiograms and life-saving treatment like percutaneous insertion procedures, such as coronary artery stenting, which, thanks to modern medicine, does not require open heart surgery anymore. This is absolutely possible in Mildura and ought to be funded. Local and timely access to this procedure will give access to more people to undergo preventative and acute angiograms. As I said in my maiden speech, your postcode should not determine your health status. But right now, in so many ways, it still does, including when it comes to preventative heart failure. Increasing access to services is just one way to improve our health outcomes in the regions. Speaker, I note that the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee has recommended the Australian Government subsidise access to Jardiance. Jardiance is the first medicine indicated to treat patients with heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, HFpEF, to reduce the risk of cardiovascular death or hospitalisation due to heart failure. It has been clinically proven and approved by the TGA and is a breakthrough for the 200,000 Australians currently living with HFpEF. I fully support the Advisory Committee's recommendations and manufacturer Boehringer Ingelheim's bid to have Jardiance listed on the PBS for these patients. This has the potential to shift the dial for regional patients with this form of heart failure. The Labor government has done little to ease the cost of living pressures on Australian households, and here lies a simple way to make a difference through subsidised access to potential life-saving medicine. The Coalition have always supported measures to tackle heart disease. Heart health checks were introduced in 2019 to the MBS. 4 years on, and these checks are now under threat.
The question is the House to now adjourn and give the call to the honourable member for Lyons.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, over the last 10 months, the contribution of those opposite to public debate has been more nutty than a Snickers bar. They've suddenly realised that the cost of living is important. They've realised this after 9 years of failed government. They didn't care about the cost of living when the opposition leader proposed a GP tax when he was health minister. They didn't care about the cost of living when the opposition leader proposed charging Australians for visits to hospital emergency departments. They didn't care about cost of living when they kept wages low for a decade as a deliberate part of their economic policy. They didn't care about cost of living when they sailed penalty rates cuts through, slashing the incomes for young, casual and shift workers. And, Speaker, they certainly didn't care about the cost of living when they created robo-debt, a scheme that literally stole, the money of vulnerable Australians whose only crime had been to seek a hand from the government at their time of need, but were then ordered to pay back money regardless of their protests, regardless of their situation, and as we are learning, leading to some tragic outcomes and consequences. Now compare that, Speaker, to the efforts of the Albanese government in the 10 months since we've been in office. One of the first things we did was back in a wage rise for low-paid workers, keeping true to our promise that we would back wage rises for workers. From January 1 this year, we backed in cheaper medicines. And since implementing that policy at the start of this year, people in my electorate of Lyons have been able to save a total of $95,000 on their prescription medications in January and February alone. That's an average saving of $11 per script. It's an immense saving that's here to stay permanently under the Albanese government. It's a policy that's putting money back in the pockets of everyday Australians and ensuring they keep more of their pay at the end of the day. Speaker, other things that we've been doing, and just this week I had the great pleasure of joining with Assistant Ministers Emma McBride and Jed Kearney to launch the new national framework that will help nurses in rural and remote communities. This framework ensures we are able to address workforce factors, improve employment and employment retention in the regions for the benefit of those communities. Under the previous government, our regional and rural communities were frankly ignored time and time again. This framework is the start of what we hope are many great policies and ambitions for our regional and remote communities. We care about regional and rural communities. There's myself here, and I note the member for Whitlam is at the dispatch box, another regional community representative on our side, and there's a number on this side. We care about the regions on this side of the House, Speaker, and I can guarantee to people in regional Australia that you are absolutely better off under this government. Speaker, one of the things that's really facing us at the moment, and I note the Green housing spokesperson is in the chamber, our nation is enduring a housing crisis and more people than ever are facing homelessness. But as the Prime Minister has said, and I implore the Greens, stop arguing against supporting a $10 billion housing and homelessness package because you want more, because the alternative is to have nothing. You know, you are getting in the way. You are getting in the way. You are getting in the way of women escaping domestic violence, of veterans, of people in vulnerable situations accessing housing sooner. That's what you're getting in the way of.
Order. The member for Lyons will direct his comments through the chair.
I apologise, Speaker. I know you wouldn't want to be associated with that. So that is something.
The member will continue with his speech.
Thank you, Speaker. So under this government's Housing Future Fund, we will build more affordable and social housing to ensure that more people can live in safe and secure circumstances. The Australian government is also investing $67.5 million to boost homelessness services funding to states and territories over the next year. It's real policy that will have real results. Another big thing coming through on July 1, Speaker, is cheaper childcare. We are making this cheaper for 1 million Australian families. Anyone with children know that childcare is essential, but it's expensive and the costs have been going up. Under the Liberals and Nationals, it went up by 49%, and that's shameful. Under our plan, it will come down. You can put your kids in for longer and it'll cost you less, and more women can go to work as a result. Thank you, Speaker.
The question is the House now adjourned. I give the call to the honourable member for Macpherson.
Thank you, Speaker, and I want to take the opportunity in this debate to talk about the experience of a family in my electorate, and they and their circumstances really reflect the pressures that are being felt by people all across this nation as the cost of living continues to rise under this government. Jason and his wife Emma have 2 small children. They purchased their home in Robina in 2021 and secured a fixed mortgage, which will soon be coming to an end. Jason currently pays around $2,000 a month for their 4-bedroom home, but the rise in interest rates will see their finances take a huge hit, with repayments expected to more than double. As interest rates continue to go up month after month under this government, everyday Australians, like Jason, are seriously stressed. Jason has already taken a second job and cancelled the children's swimming lessons in anticipation. He's determined to ensure that they don't lose the family home that they worked so hard to buy and to renovate. As Jason said in a recent news article, and I quote, "It's a flow-on effect as interest rates go up and repayments go up, but then you have day-to-day living costs. You have shopping, insurance, registration for vehicles, electricity, rates and water bills. Our repayments are going to double, and you have the burden of everything else going up on the back of that. It does bring stress into the household, which is unfortunate, and it's difficult to work so much and be so tired from that and stressed from trying to pull everything together." Speaker, unfortunately, Jason is not alone in this experience. He is one of 800,000 mortgage holders in Australia who are facing a mortgage cliff as their lower fixed rate ends and their budgets have already taken a hit in the past year. And I do have to ask the question as part of this debate about what the plan is from the Labor government to deal with these significant cost of living issues. Now, housing is one of the most significant issues for people in Australia at the moment. As I've just described Jason's circumstances and the fact that his circumstances are repeated in many, many households right across Australia. The question then becomes, what is the Labor government doing to support Jason? Now, we know that interest rates are rising. We know that that will be a cost of living impact. But we also know with the housing crisis that many people are finding it very difficult to find a house to purchase in the first instance because the cost of that house has gone absolutely through the roof. We also know that vacancy rates on rentals are at all-time lows in many parts of Australia. Now, in my electorate on the Gold Coast, I can assure the House that it is extraordinarily difficult to be able to find a property to rent in the first instance. And if you do find something, there are many people also seeking to rent that property, and the price of that rental is sky high. So we have an issue where the people in Australia are really struggling to keep that roof over their heads, and that is quite separate to the issue of those people who have been impacted by domestic and family violence, where we know, and there is significant evidence to show that people who have been affected by domestic and family violence are staying in violent situations simply because they cannot afford to leave. And they cannot afford to leave because they either can't find somewhere to go to, or they can't afford the costs in the instances that they can find something. I would encourage people to have a look around them and see what is happening in the shops. We see that there's a decline in number of people going to shopping centres. Certainly they are still going there for the supermarkets, but other stores that are part of the larger shopping complexes are really struggling to attract customers into their shops. If you look at the number of people that are visiting those shopping centres, it is obviously in a state of decline. It's gone down particularly since Christmas, but quite frankly, many of us who are in shopping centres pre-Christmas would have noticed that the number of people there had significantly gone down. Often you see people walking around shopping centres and they haven't bought anything at all. They've certainly bought food that they must have. This is a serious impact for those people who are in the retail sector, but more importantly, the cost of living for people in Australia has to be dealt with, and the Labor government is missing in action.
The question is, the House to now adjourn and give the call to the honourable member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Today is a momentous day. The community wanted action on climate change, the business community wanted action on climate change, and the government wanted action on climate change. The community spoke at the federal election last year that they wanted to see our country move to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. For decades, the business community has said that they wanted business certainty. And today, this week, we have seen that the 47th Parliament of Australia wanted action on climate change. The Safeguard Mechanism Bill is about today and tomorrow. And I note that there are students here, and it's really important that you are here. Sorry, through the chair. And it's important that students are here and witness what it is that members of Parliament are doing in this place. Many people know that I was born and bred in a mining town. I'm an engineer that's worked on the mines, and I spent the last 10 years working with companies to help them reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. The thing that I saw for that decade that I worked in that area is that the policy uncertainty was awful. There was so much chopping and changing, and companies were trying to adjust to what they needed to do, and it just wasn't there. Today is what it signifies is that we're sending strong signals to businesses to know that we expect them to pull their weight. I have a friend that works in HR at FMG, Fortescue Metals Group, which many people would know is one of Twiggy Forrester's company. FMG has two arms, the iron ore business, but also the hydrogen business. And the thing that's really interesting when I speak to her friend, she talks about how excited people are to work in the clean energy sector. And if you think about what motivates people, it's about autonomy, mastery and purpose. And what people want is purpose in their vocation and purpose in clean energy jobs. And this policy with the National Reconstruction Fund will unlock clean energy jobs. John Howard knew that we needed action on climate change. That's why he introduced the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act. I'm shocked today that the Coalition did not vote for climate action. Did they not get the memo? Did they not see the election results? Are they trying to be irrelevant? Have they not had a look at the crossbench? I'm wondering what their election strategy will be last election. Now, I know that climate change has been historically quite political and has blown up political leaders and parties, but the thing that I want to assure people is that this policy is tight and the Labor Party is united. I also have to take my hat off to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. I cannot imagine the complexity of balancing the inputs from different people, from the crossbench to the NGO community to businesses, but somehow we've done this. And for the children of Australia, I want them to know that this Parliament wants to make sure that they inherit a livable planet. I think that that is critical, and I think that that's something that everyone deserves to be a part of. I remember when I was studying my university course, and there was a young woman that was quite brilliant who ended up getting Ducks of the Year, and there was an oil and gas company that was wanting to court the most brilliant students, and it was the first time that they had provided a job offer, but this young woman was kind of like, actually, I'd like to work in a different area. And it was the first time that they'd seen that. And the thing that I imagine that we're going to see is the decarbonisation of the economy across the board, and this is going to be really exciting. And the truth is, what we'll now see is our large polluters reducing their emissions, and I'm glad that there's also an absolute baseline associated with that. To Swan, it is such a privilege to be elected to this place and to work for you and deliver good policy. I remember knocking on doors in Swan and people wanted action on climate change, and I remember one day when 3 neighbours, all in their own words, explained that they wanted action on climate change. Please know that I do not take one day for granted. And to Lincoln and Felicity, know that this is one of the reasons why I've stood in this place, and I'm really looking forward to creating great policy and creating that positive future. Thank you very much.
The question is the House to adjourn. I give a call to the honourable member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. A few weeks ago, a group of residents came to me with a simple question. What's more important for the community in Greenslopes, another McDonald's or an established medical centre that currently serves over 3,000 residents? I think it's fair to say that the community knows what we'd prefer. The medical centre is deeply concerned that this development will be the end of their practice. I don't want to be a buzzkill, but I don't think we really need another McDonald's right here. There are already 5 McDonald's locations within a 7 to 12-minute drive of the site. What the community does need is clinics like Greenslopes Family Practice. The Australian Medical Association has projected a shortage of more than 10,000 GPs by 2031. Every week in my office I hear of residents struggling to access medical care in Griffith, in particular access to GPs. It's yet another case where we've seen our planning framework which maximises profits for developers and big multinationals rather than what the community actually needs. The thousands of residents of Griffith impacted by severe and harmful flight noise from Brisbane Airport have been stunned to told that the Minister for Infrastructure has refused to meet with them. Apparently, the Minister has plenty of time to meet with the aviation industry representatives and attend air shows to cosy up with the government's friends in big business, but not to speak to representatives from the community crying out for action. People are calling for decisive action. They're asking for the basic measures that Sydney Airport has, a nighttime curfew and a cap on flight movements. In all the years of reports and reviews into the new runway debacle, nobody has been able to explain to me or them why the solutions that are good enough for Sydney are not good enough for Brisbane. Early this month at the National Press Club, the Minister told the community that if we want a curfew, we're going to have to protest for it. Well, I've heard from a lot of furious residents who just may take her up on that. The Greens won't be backing down. We will be supporting the community to take action, as we have supported action on flight noise from the very beginning. Good luck to the government if they think they can ignore this community forever. The fight to save East Brisbane State School and Raymond Park from the disastrous plan to waste at least $2.7 billion demolishing and rebuilding the Gabba Stadium is far from over. The Australian Olympic Committee CEO, Matt Carroll, just this week said the quiet part out loud about the Gabba when he said the Olympics and Paralympics will use it for a month. They could just give it a coat of paint. He's right. The Gabba does not need to be knocked down and rebuilt. The plan to bulldoze the only public primary school in one of the densest, fastest-growing areas of inner-city Brisbane is such a spectacular failure of the government's most basic responsibilities. That is to ensure that every community has a school. Meanwhile, Raymond Park is home to a children's playground, basketball court, football club, sports field and a much-loved community garden, not to mention people's homes. Ask anyone living within 3 kilometres of that park what it's worth to them. The vast majority of people in Queensland and across Australia oppose this project. They know that this money, $2.7 billion at least, should be used to build public housing, schools, hospitals in areas that need them, not used to demolish a school and public park. And we'll be fighting to make sure that this project is stopped and we spend this money in this country where it's needed. We're told constantly by the political system that we can't hope for more. That we can't hope for more. We're told that there isn't enough money for public housing or raising the pension, the DSP and job seeker payments so that people aren't forced to live in poverty and tents in the park. But we're told there is $368 billion for nuclear attack submarines that will make us less safe. No questions asked about that money. There is $7 billion for sports stadiums for an Olympic Games that the people of Brisbane were never asked if they wanted. And there's hundreds of billions of dollars to give the rich the tax cuts that they don't need or deserve. The people of Griffith sent me here to fight for them, to be a voice for ordinary people who are screwed over every day by governments who care more about their corporate donors and multinational corporations and billionaires getting richer than it does about people having safe and affordable homes or enough food to eat. To build movements that grow and grow in power until we force the government to act, that is what we need to do. To build the homes we need so that no one is left out in the cold, to ensure every single person in this country has what they need to live a good life, and we won't stop fighting until we get there.
Big question is the House to now adjourn, and I give the call to the honourable member for Fraser.
Speaker, on Sunday I attended the 30th anniversary of the Polish Museum and Archives in Australia and heard a remarkable migration story about the rats of Tobruk. Not the legendary World War II Australian soldiers, but the Polish rats, the Polish Independent Carpathian Brigade, who reinforced the Allied garrison to hold the Libyan port of Tobruk. For 8 months in 1941, the garrison withstood daily bombings, searing heat and bitter nights. After the war, the soldiers were transported to Britain. While Churchill had assured the troops they'd be welcome, a campaign soon turned public sentiment, and soldiers were told that they would not be able to remain on UK soil. And thus started Polish migration to Australia, despite the long-standing preference for British migrants. Following furious lobbying of Arthur Calwell by Australian Rats of Tobruk associations and others, 1,500 Polish soldiers were accepted. As one digger stated, "These men are not Poles, these men are our brothers." This migrant scheme of 1947 to 1948, the first coordinated intake of non-British migrants, was also a catalyst for the Australian Citizenship Act of 1948. But it wasn't a free ride. The soldiers had to work for 2 years on hydroelectric projects in Tasmania, projects that, like the Polish community, continue to this day to benefit the Australian community. Speaker, my electorate has a number of thriving social enterprises. Just around the corner from my electorate office is Salama Tea, a cafe serving Persian food. Its founder, Hamed Al-Yari, who has called Melbourne home since migrating to Australia from Iran in 2012, went above and beyond to feed people during COVID. Hamed's first paid employment was running cooking classes with the social enterprise Free to Feed. His experience inspired him to open a similar social enterprise to provide opportunities to refugees, asylum seekers and migrants who face the same problems that he did when he arrived in this country. Another thriving social enterprise is Green Collect, which was co-founded 15 years ago by Sally Quinn, which keeps office items out of landfill by reusing, repurposing and dismantling the items. It is a remarkable example of what can be achieved in a true circular economy. Sally, a social worker, knew that a job with meaning was the key to rebuilding lives for those experiencing difficulties, whether they were refugees, people experiencing homelessness, or survivors of family violence. With a female-dominated workforce, Green Collect is not only transforming the waste sector and transforming lives, it is also transforming the workplace. 100-storey building has another amazing story to tell. It uses the arts, creativity and imagination to build critical literacy skills, confidence and a sense of belonging. Their work focuses on young people aged 5 to 18 from the most disadvantaged communities, economically, culturally and socially. Many migrant and refugee families take advantage of this remarkable social enterprise. They have worked with more than 45,000 young people and 2,000 teachers since 2013. These social enterprises in my electorate are replicated right across the state of Victoria and nationally. These social enterprises are organisations with a purpose. They produce employment for people from a disadvantaged background, and they also undertake their activities with many other important social objectives in mind, such as protecting the environment. The social enterprise sector has grown dramatically in Australia over recent decades, and it is important that government play its role in helping the sector to further grow. This could include accreditation and, where appropriate, social procurement. I look forward to working with the social enterprises in my electorate and more broadly.
It being 5 p.m, the House stands adjourned until Tuesday, 9 May 2023 at 12 noon.
But can I also note what we said in the Coalition members' additional comments? And it was important for us as a committee to remember that this was a once-in-a-generation pandemic. The circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic were extraordinary and the response was unprecedented, but there are certainly lessons to be learnt from a response of that magnitude. The Morrison government declared the COVID-19 pandemic on the 27th of February 2020, before the World Health Organization declared it on the 11th of March 2020. This early acknowledgement and the action in closing international borders meant the government could put health and economic measures in place to protect lives and livelihoods, remembering that at that time there was no sight of any vaccine for this new virus. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade established a crisis framework that enabled it to successfully assist 61,755 Australians to return and on facilitated flights, of which there were 227, which again is unprecedented in its scale, scope and time frame and challenges, given that the global airline industry had pretty much shut down. The response to the pandemic was tough, but it did allow Australia to be one of the few countries to come out of the pandemic stronger, with over 95% of Australians vaccinated, which also saved at least 40,000 Australian lives. As of February 2023, more than 64 million vaccine doses had been administered here in Australia, and that's despite misinformation and also the undermining efforts of some in the community. But the Department of Health's Is It True portal opened on the 14th of March and provided information on the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine rollout in more than 63 languages for multicultural communities across Australia. In Australia, from the 3rd of January 2020 to the 21st of March 2023, there have been 11,380,700 confirmed cases of COVID-19, with 19,447 deaths reported to the World Health Organization, meaning Australia has contributed 0.28% of the world's fatalities due to COVID-19 and 1.5% of reported cases. Other large economies, comparable economies, such as the United States, China and India, who did not implement the measures that Australia did, had significantly higher cases and also, sadly, deaths. The United States, for example, had confirmed more than 102 million cases, which was 13.5% of global cases, and more than 1 million Americans died of COVID-19, which was over 16% of global deaths. So the Americans have achieved 69% of the population fully vaccinated, whereas here in Australia, as I said, we had over 90%, in fact 96%. So there is no doubt that the JobKeeper payment and other federal government financial supports that the Morrison government implemented played a key role in supporting the nation's economy throughout the pandemic, and also ensured that businesses could keep employees connected to them during these terrible times. The Reserve Bank estimated that this payment alone, the JobKeeper payment, reduced total job losses by 700,000 between April and July 2020. And Treasury estimates that the unemployment rate would have been at least 5% higher than it turned out to be because of JobKeeper. The Morrison government's $314 billion in direct economic support included payments to individuals and support to businesses, also contributed to Australia keeping its AAA credit rating, one of only 9 countries, only one of 9 countries in the world to achieve this. So they were extraordinary times, and as the committee reported, DFAT certainly did a sterling job in dealing with Australians who are stranded overseas and repatriating them to Australia. So in conclusion, Mr Deputy President, I thank all of the contributors to this inquiry, particularly the DFAT officers who appeared at the public hearing and also facilitated a site inspection of the Department's crisis management facilities. I also thank all fellow members of the JCPAA who participated in this inquiry. They continuing the bipartisan tradition of this committee. And finally, can I give a huge thanks to the amazing committee secretariat for their support and their professionalism throughout this inquiry. And I seek leave to continue my remarks.
Leave is granted. Thank you, Senator Reynolds. No further contributions. Sorry, Minister. The President has received letters requesting changes in the membership of committees. Minister.
I seek leave to move a motion to vary the membership of committees.
Leave is granted.
Thank
Minister.
You. I move that senators be discharged from and appointed to committees as set out in the document available in the chamber and listed in the dynamic red.
Brilliant. So we'll now move to item 18, which is consideration of documents which are listed on pages 7 and 8 of the notice paper. A reminder that any document to which no senator rises will be taken to be discharged from the notice paper. And I call Senator Walsh.
Thank you, Deputy President. I take note of documents 1, 6, 7 and 12 on page 7 and seek leave to continue my remarks.
Leave is granted. Thank you, Senator. I'll go Senator Scarr, then I'll go to you, Senator Shoebridge.
Thank you, and thank you for your indulgence, Senator Shoebridge. I am taking note of documents 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, 11, 15 and 16 and seek leave to continue my remark.
I think leave is granted. Thank you, Senator Scarr, and I'll call you Senator Shoebridge. Thank you.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. I seek leave to table a non-conforming petition in relation to the plans for the redevelopment of the Randwick Barracks site.
I don't know if this is the correct. Okay, and I'm just checking around. I think looking at the appropriate people.
It's been circulated.
Okay, so it looks like leave is granted, Senator Shoebridge. Yes.
I table the petition seeking to stop the plans for the redevelopment of the Randwick Barracks site with a total of 660 signatures.
Excellent. Thank you, Senator Shoebridge, for that. I'm looking around the chamber in relation to no one else wishes to speak on documents. So we'll now move to item 19. The Senate will now proceed to the consideration of committee reports, government responses and Auditor General's reports, which are listed at pages 8 to 9 of the notice paper. Any report or response to which no senator rises will be taken to be discharged from the notice paper. Senator Walsh.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. I take note of reports 2, 3 and 4 on page 8 and seek leave to continue my remarks.
I think leave is granted. Senator Scarr, and then I'll come to you, Senator Cox. Sorry.
Thank you. Senator Cox. We'll see if any are left. I rise to take note of, I think number 4 was already done.
4's been done, yeah.
Yeah, so I rise to take note of the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport References Committee Fisheries Quota System report and seek leave to continue my remarks.
I think leave is granted, and I'm going to Senator Cox.
Thank you, Acting Deputy Chair. I rise to speak to document 1, listed the examination of the Australian Federal Police annual reports of 2021-22 by the Law Enforcement Joint Statutory Committee.
Senator Cox, you have the call.
Thank you. In 2020, the AFP announced the establishment of a First Nations unit. The purpose of this unit was to promote full and unhindered Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participation in the AFP's workforce and inform the provision of culturally aware policing services in the Australian community. In 2021's annual report, it states that this unit will have 3 initial priorities, and they were embedding cultural awareness, strengthening cultural competency and supporting its First Nations members. In the 2021-22 report, it states that the AFP will continue to work closely, enhancing partnerships and supporting the front line, which includes the establishment of the AFP's First Nations Advisory Board. This board would have the responsibility for informing its strategic agenda and specific inclusion initiatives relating to First Nations matters for the AFP. As a former police officer and a First Nations woman, I'm glad to see the AFP is taking some action. However, I know firsthand that we in fact have a long way to go, not only in the police's dealings with First Nations people, but also the inclusion of First Nations people in police forces around this country. First Nations people have historically been disproportionately targeted by police. We are arrested more, we are more likely to be sentenced, we have longer sentences, and once we're in custody, as we discussed earlier this week, we're more likely to die in custody. This is in fact shameful, and there are many stories about the injustices that face First Nations people within our so-called justice system. The Australian-New Zealand Police Advisory Agency has 3 anti-racism and culturally diverse principles that are aimed to ensure both countries fulfil their obligations under the international treaties, such as the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples anti-discrimination legislation. So I would like to highlight some of those to you. One being to understand and respond to the historical context and ongoing lived experiences of First Nations people, to actively take steps to ensure people from diverse backgrounds are recruited, promoted and in fact retained within police forces, provide police with awareness, skills, knowledge to enable them to identify and address how their own biases are both learned and unconscious and impact on their decision-making and in fact on their behaviour. All 8 of these principles are vitally important in having a diverse police force that understands, respects cultural differences, and particularly for First Nations people, I urge the AFP and all of the state and territory police forces in this country to fully adopt all these principles. However, time and time again, we read about First Nations people being shot, tackled, thrown to the ground and otherwise subjected to very, very brutal treatment. And in fact, I had a phone call very similar to this to my electoral office last night, in fact, about this type of behaviour. In my home state of Western Australia, just last year, the WA Police released police dogs onto a 13-year-old boy, which left him hospitalised and needing surgery. Police dogs are, as has been covered in a CCC report in Western Australia by the Chief, John McKechnie, saying that the present policies are not racist in intent, but in fact are racist by the way that they are carried out. Now, police dogs are disproportionately used against First Nations people, some of those people in Western Australia as young as 9 years old. So this is not a training office issue for the dogs, as some people have alluded to that myth. This is about police officers and handlers having control of those dogs. And I urge both the AFP and other law enforcement agencies in this country to urgently make sure that they are enforcing and implementing those ANSPAR principles to address some of these systemic issues that are happening across police forces in Australia. We clearly have an exceptionally long way to go before First Nations people feel safe and have their own well-being being looked after in this country. Thank you.
Senator Cox, just checking, I'm assuming you might want leave to continue your remarks?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Leave is granted. Thank you for that. And we have no further business, so we'll move on to ministerial statements. And I call the Minister.
Thank you. I table documents relating to orders for the production of documents concerning the goods and services tax, discretionary payments to the Australian Labor Party, costs relating to parliamentary sittings, superannuation balances and alcohol and drug-related incidents in Sejuna.
Thank you, Minister.
One more. And on behalf of the Minister for Resources, Ms Madeline King, I table a ministerial statement on resources.
Senator McDonald.
I rise to take note of the ministerial statement on resources.
Okay, Senator McDonald, you have the call.
Thank you. Australia may have ridden on the sheep's back, but it was the pursuit of minerals that has accelerated our development as a modern nation, and it is the strength of our resources sector that continues to underpin our economic growth in the 21st century. The resources sector employs over 1.1 million Australians, a sector that has paid over $37.2 billion in wages and salaries last year straight into Australian households, which is set to deliver $459 billion in export earnings over 2022-23, strengthening our budget and delivering funding for roads, for schools, for hospitals right across the country, a sector that makes up 14.5% of our gross domestic profit, that paid over 40% of the $68.6 billion in company tax and $16.7 billion in royalties to the states and territories in Australia in 2020-21, which underpinned our COVID-19 recovery, and a sector the government acknowledges is propping up the budget bottom line. A sector that was strongly supported by the Coalition, has greatly benefited all Australians, and it has the potential to remain an exciting and prosperous industry for Australia. Now, Australia is blessed with bountiful resource deposits from coal and iron ore to gas and oil and vast pockets of critical minerals and rare earths, many of which are found in our everyday lives. Critical minerals are found in our phones, our cars and banknotes. They play a crucial role in defence technology and are even found in fertilisers that help feed the nation. Coal, gas and other traditional energy commodities are vital in manufacturing and continue to underpin our electricity grid, providing secure, reliable and affordable energy for households and businesses across the country.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister.
Order.
Will the Prime Minister rule out any changes in the budget to the tax treatment of work expenses?
Order. I could not hear the Shadow Treasurer's question. Out of respect for him, I'm going to ask him so I can hear and the whole chamber can hear the question. I give the call to the Honourable Member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister rule out any changes in the budget to the tax treatment of work expenses?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Like other governments in the past, what we will do is hand down our budget in 40 days' time, the Treasurer said, and it'll be a good one. And what we'll be aiming at doing, what we'll be aiming at doing there is addressing both the short-term pressures that are on cost of living, and you'll see those measures, including our energy price relief plan, including, of course, the other plans budgeted for, cheaper childcare, cheaper medicines, all of those measures. But you'll also see the funding of plans that are based upon dealing with the medium and longer-term challenges in our economy, the pressures that are on the health system, the pressures that are on supply chains through our National Reconstruction Fund, dealing with skills and making sure that people can get appropriate training and education going forward as well.
The member for Moreton. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? Order. I'll hear from the member for Hume on a point of order.
Relevance, Mr Speaker. It was a very specific question. We don't need pixie dust.
The member for Hume knows that is not an appropriate use of the standing order and has the MPI today. The Prime Minister will return to the question.
One of the things, I was surprised to see them taking a point on relevance. Never has an opposition worked so hard to make themselves irrelevant. On every issue.
Order. The Prime Minister will
return.
return.
I predict this,
Order. The Prime Minister will return to the question.
I predict this about our budget next month. Whatever's in it, you'll be against it.
Order. Order. When the House, the member for Moreton is warned. Order. When the House comes to order, well, it would have done something today. Order. I'll hear from the member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How will passage of the Albanese government's safeguard reforms progress action on climate change and deliver a strong economy? And are there any obstacles to these reforms?
Order. Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I recognise the expertise and experience of the member for Swan in climate change and resources, and I appreciate her counsel as well as her question. And I'm very pleased to inform the member for Swan and the House that just before question time, the government's safeguard legislation passed the Australian Senate 32 votes to 26, Mr Speaker. What the parliament has done today is safeguard our climate, safeguard our economy and safeguard our future, Mr Speaker. What the parliament has done today is draw an end to 10 years of dysfunction and 10 years of delay. What the parliament has done today is start the Australian industrial economy on the road to decarbonisation. We can now get on with the job of reducing our emissions by 43%. We can now get on with the job of creating jobs of the future in a decarbonised economy. That's what this parliament has done today, Mr Speaker. I've met just even today with chief executives of Australian industry who've told me now they have the certainty to make investments which will reduce carbon and create jobs. Now they have the certainty, they've told me and the government, and they are keen to get on with it.
Order.
And I want to note, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the Senate. I want to thank the Green senators. I want to thank Senator Lambie, Senator Tyrrell, Senator Thorpe and Senator Pocock. The vote of 32 to 26 and the vote in the House of 87 to 55 means that this parliament reflects the will of the Australian people, Mr Speaker. Reflects the will of the Australian people to take action on climate. I was asked if there are any obstacles. Well, there were a few. There is a rump of irrelevance, but that rump of irrelevance has been overcome. And the numbers in the House and in the Senate reflect the broad coalition. The government's policy has been supported by the Business Council of Australia and the Climate Council, the Australian Conservation Foundation and the Australian Industry Group, Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and groups right across the board. The Albanese government knows how to build coalitions, Mr Speaker. The coalition has forgotten. There's a broad coalition in favour of support and a little coalition fighting on against action on climate change. For too long in this country, the government of the day weaponised climate policy to divide Australians, to pit Australians in the regions against Australians in the cities. This government uses climate to unite Australians in our great national endeavour to reduce our emissions and create the jobs of the future. In the regions right across Australia, the great regions that power Australia, Those regions will be the centre of our renewable economy. This government gets on with the job and gets over 10 years of denial and delay.
The member for Lawler. Give the call to the Leader of the Nationals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Under government modelling, how much will electricity prices increase for households and businesses from the safeguard mechanism?
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and
Zero,
Energy.
because the electricity sector is not covered by the safeguards
The
mechanism.
member for Fairfax. Order. Members on my right. The Leader of the Nationals will. The Minister for Climate Change and the Minister for Home Affairs will cease interjecting immediately, as will the member for Groom, or he shall be warned as well. So I can hear from the member for McEwen.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry and Science. How is the Albanese Labor government delivering on its commitment to support Australian manufacturers and create jobs? What opposition has there been to these efforts?
Give a call to the Minister for Industry and Science.
Thanks, Speaker, and thanks to the member for McEwen for the question and also for his service as the Chair of the House of Representatives, Industry, Science and Resources. And Speaker, when you talk with any Australian manufacturing worker, the one thing that stands out in them is pride. They are proud of what they make. They're proud of the products that they're making a contribution to the economy. They're proud of what they're doing for exporting, and they're proud to make a difference in someone's lives. And a lot of us know this firsthand because we're the sons and daughters of manufacturing workers. We've seen it in our own families. And the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund that got the support of the Parliament this week is not just providing growth capital for those firms, it's sending an important signal. It's Australians backing Australians. It is about the fact that we've got the backs of Australian manufacturing workers and their businesses, that modern economies, especially big economies, need a strong manufacturing capability running through them. Manufacturing matters. It creates secure jobs. And it's not just in our cities, but it's in our regions as well. For example, in Victoria, more than a quarter of manufacturing jobs in the regions. In New South Wales, 35%. In Queensland, over 40%. Now, the NRF should be a platform to create secure jobs in sectors and in activities like value-adding in resources, in agriculture, fisheries, forestry, defence, renewables and low-emission technologies, medical sciences, advanced manufacturing. Creating work for boilermakers through to bioengineers, designers through to fitters and turners, medical scientists, warehouse managers, software experts, technicians and more. We want the NRF to have a strong regional impact. But you couldn't help, when you listen carefully to the Liberal and National attack lines used to attack manufacturing and the National Reconstruction Fund, you didn't feel like they were talking about us. You thought more about them. It was Liberal and National MPs talking about jobs for mates. It was Liberal and National MPs talking about slush funds. It was Liberal and National MPs talking about politically motivated projects in marginal seats. Now, the sad reality is they're talking about the way they did business. That's the way they looked at it.
Order. Members on my left.
I'm sad to inform the Liberal and National parties that, well, your business model is finished. Drawing on the greats like Monty Python, it's a dead parrot of a business model. It's joined the choir in Visibule. It is gone. We are done with doing that. It is about an independent board making decisions free of colour-coded spreadsheets, not doing it in the way that you did business, and importantly backing Australian manufacturing, because that...
The House comes to order. Here for the member for Casey.
Speaker, my question to the Prime Minister. More and more Australians are having to make difficult decisions to make ends meet. Uniting Care has told the Senate's inquiry into Labor's cost of living crisis that they're witnessing a surge in first-time support recipients who they describe as double-income earning families finding themselves at risk of poverty, homelessness and financial stress. When will this out-of-touch Prime Minister finally admit to Australian families that they will always pay more under Labor?
Order. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Casey for his question. The fact is that we are taking action to address cost of living pressures. We know that inflation is causing pressures in households, in the members' electorate and in electorates right around Australia, and that's why we've introduced cheaper medicines, why we're having cheaper childcare, why we've got fee-free TAFE, and I've certainly visited the TAFE areas in the members' electorate, in fact, in the past, and know the good work that they do. I tell you what we won't do, though. What we will do as a Labor government is always protect people who are vulnerable. And that stands in stark contrast to what those opposite did, which is to establish an illegal scheme, robo-debt, which attacked the most vulnerable. So that's the contrast between this government and the former government.
Order.
Sandra Bevan, who appeared at the Commission, is a single mum of 4 sons who received a $3,000 Centrelink debt letter.
The Prime Minister will pause. The order. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, Mr Speaker, on relevance, you've previously directed the Prime Minister back to the topic of a question when he's veered off it, as he have. This is a question about cost of living crisis in the United Kingdom.
Order. I want to deal with this issue. At the end of these questions, there is a tag question about who pays more under which government. If that is part of a question, when that's included, that's inviting a comparison, and it's also inviting to talk broadly about who does pay more or less under which government. So if you don't want that part of the question to be answered, don't include that in the question. I call the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. This is what Sandra Bevan had to say. There were these threats of taking money directly out of my pay or out of my bank account from a tax return. It was such a weight on my shoulders. I do remember driving home at night, just beside myself with worry about this money and thinking, to quote her, I could just drive my car into a tree and make it stop. But my kids needed me. They'd already lost their dad, and I was trying my best to keep a roof over our head. Matthew Thompson appeared at the Commission as well. He incorrectly was told he owed $11,000. He said this: the robo-debt scheme has had a lasting effect on me as it had on many others. It made my mental health worse. It made me feel like a criminal and a cheat. It really messed me up. The ministers who gave evidence were referred to as the Honourable, but given what they said or did, I don't think they are honourable, and I don't think they deserve to be called honourable.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition needs to cease interjecting, otherwise action will be taken.
They were the architects of the scheme, which has caused so much pain to so many people and which has caused some people to lose their lives. That is a direct result of what those opposite did. That's a different approach that we have towards people who are vulnerable in our community.
Give the call. The member for Lyons is warned. I can't be clear about interjecting between someone who's about to ask a question. If this happens one more time, you'll be ejected from the chamber. Give the call to the member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. What is the Albanese government doing to protect vulnerable Australians from gambling harms, including gambling-like features in video games?
Give the call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. In only 10 months, the Albanese government has taken a range of important steps to minimise harm from gambling. We have implemented 3 long overdue elements of the National Consumer Protection Framework. Mandatory monthly activity statements came in last year, and from today, new evidence-based taglines with messages about the potential harms of gambling must be in place, as well as training for online wagering staff. And yesterday, I announced the government will seek the agreement of the states and territories to introduce mandatory minimum classifications for games with gambling-like features. Research commissioned by my department has found concerning associations between gambling-like features in games and harms, including problem gambling. Games with simulated gambling will be classified R18+, restricted to 18 and over, and games containing paid loot boxes, where a player can purchase a virtual box with a randomised prize inside, will attract an M rating. We know Australians value the classification framework, and these new ratings will send a strong message that there are risks associated with these products, so consumers can make an informed choice about what they and their children watch and play. But, Mr Speaker, the classification framework is in urgent need of updating. The 2020 Stevens Review, which I also released yesterday, made a range of recommendations to update the framework, including to the classification of games. Mr Speaker, those opposite received this report when they were in government back in May 2020, but they sat on it, taking no action in response to the growing body of evidence about the harms associated with gambling-like features in games. It's another example of the former government talking big about keeping Australians safe, yet they failed to respond to their own review, which showed a clear need for stronger protections. In contrast, the Albanese government is acting on this as a priority. In fact, what we are proposing actually goes further than what the Stevens Review recommended. The classification framework is one avenue to address harms associated with gambling-like features, and we know that we need a multifaceted approach. I've therefore asked my department to examine non-classification options to further the objective of harm minimisation in this area. And I note this matter is also being considered by the House inquiry into online gambling. I look forward to working with my counterparts in the states and territories to implement these changes so we can protect those most vulnerable in our community from gambling harms, including children.
Before I call the member for Indi, I understand that an unparliamentary term was used by the member for Cunningham. I'm going to ask her to withdraw that comment. I'll just wait till the microphones are on and ask you to withdraw.
I withdraw.
I thank the member. I give the call to the member for Indi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister.
Page is warned. The member for Indi will begin her question again.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing. 2021 census data released last week revealed that in Wangaratta, homelessness has increased 67% since 2016. With the passage of the government's Housing Australia Future Fund legislation in doubt, I'm worried we will be left without a plan to fix this urgent problem.
Order. Order.
What's your plan B to guarantee my constituents will have a roof over their heads?
Give the call to the Minister for Housing, Homelessness and the Minister for Small Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Indi for her question, and I also thank her for her constructive discussions around the Housing Australia Future Fund for when we passed it through this House, and I thank her for her support for that important piece of legislation. Because, of course, she does understand that this is critical to Australia's homeless people. On census night in 2021, there was 123,000 homeless Australians, and it is concerning, and it should be concerning to all of us in this place. It's a really serious issue. And indeed, that is why we last week announced some important funding for homelessness services. For the Reconnect service, over $90 million, and indeed an additional amount of $67.5 million for states and territories for homelessness services. This is on top of course, the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, whereby we've just offered the states an additional $1.6 billion for the next 12 months. That's $1.6 billion for the next 12 months for housing and homelessness services that we have offered offered to the states and territories. And of course this fits with our housing accord, our national housing accord that was in our last budget. Our National Housing Accord, of course, is another 10,000 affordable and social homes, particularly affordable rentals. Then this will be matched by the states and territories. So that's 20,000 affordable rentals from the National Housing Accord announced in our last budget. We've already immediately released the $575 million from the National Infrastructure Facility, and there are already properties starting to go up on the ground around Australia today because of that money. So I'd say to the member for Indi, and I really appreciate this question, that we are having a broad housing agenda. Obviously, the Housing Australia Future Fund is central to that because that will allow us to work with other tiers of government, with institutional investors, with community housing providers, and indeed to leverage to get more homes on the ground more quickly, which is why it's so important. And as she indicated, there are vulnerable people right across Australia today that need that legislation through the parliament. So I would say to those opposite, talk to your senators in the Senate and tell them how important this legislation is. If you're serious about housing and the housing situation in Australia today, we need that bill through the parliament. And I would say to the Greens political party, this needs to be done and needs to be done quickly. We are already delaying this because, of course, the Greens wouldn't allow us to debate it in the Senate. So I say to the Greens political party, you go back to your electorates and you tell people that houses are not on the ground today because this was not able to be brought on in the Senate. There are vulnerable people in Australia today that need these houses and they need them today.
Give the call to the member for Patterson.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. What is the Albanese government doing to make sure the next school funding agreement delivers a better and fairer education system? And how's this different to previous approaches, Minister?
Give the call to the Minister for Education.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my friend, the sensational member for Patterson, for her question. We've got a good education system in Australia, but it can be a lot better and a lot fairer. In January, the Productivity Commission released a report that revealed if you're a child from a poor family or from the bush or an Indigenous Australian, you are 3 times more likely to fall behind at school. And that report told us that over the last 10 years we've seen the reading skills of children in primary school improve, but the gap in reading skills of children from wealthy families and poor families at primary school get worse. And that report also told us that if you're a child from a poor family and you go to a school where there's a lot of disadvantage, then it's harder to catch up. And that weighs heavily on me because I went to a school like that. These are the sort of problems we've got to tackle. Now, funding is important, but so is what it's spent on, what it's invested in and what it's tied to. That Productivity Commission report was critical of the current schools agreement because it said it lacked real targets and it lacked the practical reforms that we need to tie that to tackle these sorts of problems. And I've told this parliament before that the next agreement will have those targets and it will have those sorts of practical reforms. Yesterday, I announced the expert panel whose job it will be to provide education ministers with what those targets should be and what those reforms should be that we tie future funding to. And leading this work will be Dr Lisa O'Brien, the chair of the Australian Education Research Organisation and the former CEO of the Smith family. Dr Lisa O'Brien will lead a team that also includes Lisa Paul, Professor Stephen Lamb, Dr Jordana Hunter, Dion Anderson and Professor Pasi Sahlberg. They'll report to me and other education ministers by the end of October. This is a big year, Mr Speaker, for education. Last month, the Prime Minister announced Professor Deborah Brennan will lead the most comprehensive review of early education in Australia's history. At the other end of the education spectrum, Professor Mary O'Kane is leading the Universities Accord, the biggest review of higher education in 15 years. And in between is the work that Dr Lisa O'Brien will lead. Weaving through all of this is a common thread, though, and it's about opportunity. If you're a child today from a poor family or from the bush or an Indigenous Australian, you're less likely to go to preschool, you're more likely to fall behind at primary school, you're less likely to finish high school and less likely to go to university. This is a chance to change that.
Give the call to the honourable member for Durack.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman has told the Senate inquiry into Labor's cost of living crisis that the rising cost of living is having an acute adverse impact on small and family businesses that underpin livelihoods. Prime Minister, why do Australian families and businesses always pay more under Labor?
The call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Again, we've got that tag in there, which allows me to do a comparison between this government and the former government. Although there's a link there, because if I'm not mistaken, it's a former minister in the former government who's made the submission that you're talking about. Is that right? Is that right?
The Prime Minister... Order.
Is that right?
Just the Prime Minister will direct comments through the chair.
So the political appointment made by those opposite that they leave out of the question, gives a submission which is a pro-Liberal Party submission from the former pro-Liberal Party minister. Well, shock horror.
Order.
Deirdre Chambers, what a coincidence. But the member from Western Australia, of course, I do note that in Western Australia today there's a bit of a comparison about the former government and this government. On a day when my Attorney-General has introduced very important legislation in this parliament, the former Attorney-General of the former government is a part of Clive Palmer's operation to sue the WA government for $300 billion. $300 billion.
Order.
The Liberal Party were anti-WA when they were in government.
Order.
They're anti-WA, now they're the opposition.
The Prime Minister will pause.
And they're anti-WA.
The Prime Minister will... The member for Hume. Member for Hume. Members on my right will cease interjecting, and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. So will the member Barker, so I can hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, on any reasonable test of relevance, the Prime Minister has strayed a very long way away from this question. He should either be directed back to the terms of the question or
resume your seat. The members for McNamara and McEwen are not helping. The Prime Minister will return to the question, which was about rising costs of living and the compare and contrast at the end of the question, which I think started with. And I'm listening to him carefully, but I want silence so I can hear him, and if he strays, he'll be returned to the question. We'll give him the call.
It was also about former Liberal Party ministers and Mr Porter's colleague. I mean, knowing Clive Palmer's record for paying his workers, I hope Christian Porter asked for his money up front. I hope he got that. I mean, together at last. Palmer and Porter. Name a more iconic duo, I dare you.
Order. Prime Minister has concluded his answer. The member for Wannon can resume his seat. Order. Members on my left. Members on my left and right. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Spence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Government Services, and I refer to the Minister's answer on Tuesday. In light of Dr Watt's review into contracts and procurements, why is disclosing conflicts of interest important for public officials?
Give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
I thank the member for his question. On Tuesday, I updated the House on a matter which went to the core of the Dr Watt review into procurements at the NDIA and Services Australia. I refer to procurement contracts relating to unregistered lobbying firm Synergy 360 and multinational IT company Unisys.
The Manager of Opposition Business will cease interjecting.
A key red flag of Dr Watt's review is the failure to declare conflicts, both real and perceived. And so far I've been unable to locate any disclosure of the member for Fadden disclosing his relationship with Synergy 360 anywhere. Now, leaked emails from Unisys and Synergy 360 executives reveal how they plan to use the lobbying firm's special connection with the member for Fadden to gain special, privileged and commercially valuable access to the important anti-corruption, the ACLI committee in Parliament, and also other decision-makers in government. I quote directly from an internal email from the Unisys Vice President to Unisys Head Office in the States on the 16th of October. It glowingly reports, "Thanks for putting this together. I told Stuart I'd get him something tonight. Tomorrow at the Joint Committee for the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity, he'll be proposing the committee formally meets with Unisys for a briefing on our work with the US government." There's another email between two of the owners of Synergy 360 on the 31st of October. They are excited at the big payday to be delivered by this undeclared special friendship with a member for Fadden. I quote, "Bloody amazing, considering we only officially launched on the 1st of June. Some companies don't even make a profit, let alone clear 100,000 in the first 3 to 4 months. This year isn't over, so let's aim for $1 million within the financial year." But this secret, undisclosed trapdoor of influence offered Unisys boundless commercial opportunities. Unisys wrote to Mr Milo on the 25th of September 2017, "I sent Stuart an email yesterday to follow up our meeting and request contact details for the appropriate person to arrange a presentation of the committee." The email continues, "I also asked for his thoughts on delivering a similar presentation to the National Security Committee, the NSC." How does a multinational company form the presumption that they can talk to the heart of our national security architecture in Australia? The NSC is not some judge of a corporate beauty parade looking for contracts. Whatever the opposition leader and I think of each other, I know the opposition leader who served on the NSC does not see the NSC as some sort of trailer boot market on a Sunday where the security of the nation has to listen to a beauty parade of commercial vendors, not with a relationship not disclosed by the member for Fadden.
Concluded. The minister's time has concluded. The minister's time has concluded. He will resume his seat. Order. The member for Patterson. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday you said you couldn't organise a national rent freeze because of the Constitution, but during the pandemic, National Cabinet regulated rentals with a moratorium on evictions. As well as making proposals to National Cabinet, the federal government has the power to offer grants on the condition that states freeze rent increases. The government uses the same power to regulate health and education. With so many renters one rent increase away from eviction, will he finally take national leadership and coordinate a national freeze on rent increases?
I give the call to the Prime Minister.
In part, I thank the member for his question, which in part he answered. He answered himself. During the pandemic, there were a range of things occurred with the support of everyone in this parliament. There was, for example, a circumstance whereby we were paying people's wages. We don't pay people's wages today.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Order. The Prime Minister will pause. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Order. No. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition. It's been a big 2 weeks, but I'm just going to say to her, she's on a warning now. She interjects again, she will definitely be asked to leave. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There were a range of emergency measures put in place over workplaces, support for businesses. State governments made those decisions. The idea that the national government has the power to impose a rent freeze, that is essentially to nationalise the private rental market around Australia, is just not the case. It's just not the case. And the member knows that that's the case. What we have is real solutions being put forward, and that is our National Housing Accord. That is the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement, which is where the Commonwealth, together with the states, negotiates in a way in which states then don't say, yep, we'll bank that money and withdraw our investment by the amount that the Commonwealth puts in, which is why you need to have that negotiation. This isn't an SRC. This is a national government. This is a national government. And what national governments have to do is put forward real solutions to issues.
Order. Members on my
and that's why we will also have our national homelessness strategy. But that's why the Housing Australia Future Fund, which will provide 30,000 additional homes that are affordable or social, 4,000 of which will be reserved for women and children escaping domestic violence, will provide funding for veterans at risk of homelessness, will provide $100 million for emergency housing, will provide support to repair Indigenous housing in remote communities should be passed. Now, those opposite, and you can argue during the break if you want, that you're against $10 billion of funding because you think it should be $20 billion, or whatever figure you want to pluck out. But the idea that you will support zero, which is what opposing this legislation will do, we will let members in your electorate know exactly that that's the case. That is exactly the case. So I'd say to the member and his colleagues, vote for this legislation and support it.
Time has concluded. Order. The House comes to order. I'll hear from the member for Macon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. What action is the Albanese government taking to make it easier for Australians to see a doctor, and why is action needed to improve primary health care?
Give the call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, I thank my friend and electorate neighbour for that question, because he knows that the government has no higher priority than strengthening Medicare and making it easier to see a doctor. That's why we established the $750 million Strengthening Medicare Fund and a task force of nurses, patients, doctors and policy experts to help advise us on tackling the enormous challenges we inherited after 9 years of cuts and neglect. That's why in the October budget we invested $2.9 billion in new primary care measures, which includes $220 million of grants to every general practice in Australia to help them improve patient access, their IT systems and their facilities. We're investing over $160 million to attract and retain more doctors and health workers in rural and regional Australia. And in Tasmania, we're working with the state government, a Liberal state government, to expand the single employer model down there that will make training and working in a general practice more attractive for our young doctors, growing the future health workforce of Australia. And, Mr Speaker, we're also delivering our 50 urgent care services across Australia this year, providing care out in the community for those non-life-threatening emergencies, 7 days a week, extended hours from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m, and importantly fully bulk billed, free of charge, taking pressure off our stressed hospital emergency departments. But, Mr Speaker, I'm asked why action is needed to improve primary care. And the fact is that primary care is in its worst shape in 40 years of Medicare, and there is no single person in this country more responsible for the crisis in Medicare than the Leader of the Opposition. When he was Minister for Health, he tried to introduce a tax on every single Australian every single time they visited the doctor. And when Labor blocked him in the other place, the Leader of the Opposition said proudly that he would, and I quote, do whatever it takes to get around our blockage, do whatever it takes. And so instead he started a 6-year-long freeze in the Medicare rebate, a freeze later described by the AMA as a sneaky new tax that punishes every Australian family. That freeze ripped billions and billions of dollars out of Medicare. And patients and doctors in Australia right now are paying the price for the decisions made by the Leader of the Opposition.
The Minister for
whether it's his
Infrastructure will cease
attempt to introduce his GP tax, whether it's his dearer medicines policy, whether it's his Medicare rebate freeze, his attempt to put a tax on every Australian visiting the emergency department in their local hospital, it is no wonder, Mr Speaker, that Australian doctors overwhelmingly voted this man, who is smiling about it as I speak, as Australia's worst health minister in the history of Medicare.
Concluded. Give the call to the member for Page.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. If the Voice offers advice on a policy matter that is contrary to the view of local elders and Indigenous community, how will this conflict be resolved? For example, if a local Indigenous community wanted to reintroduce the cashless debit card against the advice of the Voice, how would this be resolved?
Order. Members on my left. The Minister for Home Affairs and the Minister for Skills, if they continue to interject, will be warned and asked to leave the chamber. And the Minister for the Environment will cease interjecting. Give a call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. An Indigenous advisory body that's established by the Constitution and which provides non-binding advice to the Parliament about Indigenous affairs is the best way of addressing the need for practical guarantees that policy making will be done better in the future, without undermining the fundamental structure of the Constitution. That's my view. It's also the view of the Shadow Minister, because they're his words. It cannot veto Parliament, but rather it provides greater input into the policy-making process, which should lead to policy improvements and greater buy-in from Indigenous people across Australia. Also, a very important point going forward.
The member for Deakin. The member for Deakin, cease interjecting.
That is why. And further on, that is also the member for Barara. Well, I do want to say that on the opposition's tactics, we know that Noel Pearson had something important to say as well. And Noel Pearson, I would hope, is someone that's respected by everyone in this chamber. I've heard him quoted by people right across the Parliament in the past. And what he said was this: now's the time for us to act as Australians, not as Labor people, not as Greens, not as Liberal or National Party people. By the way, not as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but as Australians, because what we're trying to achieve here is a unity. We want inclusion. This will do it.
Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? Give the call to the member for Pearce.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Leader of the House. What has been the Albanese Labor government's approach to passing its agenda through the Parliament, and what approaches has the government rejected?
Give the call to the Leader of the House.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Pearce for the question. We've now completed 50 sitting days. 50 sitting days have been completed, and in that time we have had a different approach to our predecessors, one of whom, the previous member for Pearce, had been a Leader of the House. And one of the big changes is we debate legislation without shutting people down. We've now had, over those 50 sitting days, we've had more than 2,000 speeches on legislation, more than 2,000. Over the same time period, that is 60 hours of additional debate on legislation compared to what happened opposite. Now, the 60-hour figure is a convenient one, because they've got a 60-hour statistic of their own. Their 60-hour statistic is they spent 60 hours in divisions voting whether the member should be no further heard or whether the question should be put. And I had hoped at the end of this session, when I was asked a similar question at the end of last year, I was able to report then that there'd been no case where anyone had moved that the member be no further heard. It used to be staple for Leaders of the House, including the one who's now the Leader of the Opposition. But last week, the record got smashed. But who moved that the members be no further heard? Over there. Even in opposition, they are still addicted to silencing debate. This morning, there weren't many people in the chamber, but this morning we had a standing orders debate. And in the standing orders debate, the Manager of Opposition Business referred to the right of members, the right, like a democratic right, to be able to move that someone else not be allowed to make a sound. Now, we've all seen movies where someone gets told you have the right to be silent. According to them, you have the right to silence everybody else. That's their approach. But as we've had these debates, where the former Leader of the House, now Leader of the Opposition, when he was Leader of the House wanted to shut down debate, in his next job wants to keep shutting down debate. Similar parody actually for his predecessor, the former member for Pearce. When he was Leader of the House, wanted to back Clive Palmer, now wants to be employed by Clive Palmer. It's all continued. But in that time, we now have legislation.
The Leader will pause. Order. Members on my right, the Minister for Veterans Affairs. I'll hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. A point of order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker, on relevance, but you may not like it, but this government's priorities are totally warped.
Leader will just resume his seat while I order. I think the Deputy Leader of the Opposition knows what's coming, and as a result of the abuse of standing orders, she will leave the chamber under 94A. And the Leader of the House will continue for the remainder of the time.
As a result of that, our aged care reforms are now law. Paid family and domestic violence leave, now law. A National Anti-Corruption Commission, now law. The electric vehicles tax discount, now law. Jobs and Skills Australia, now law. Cheaper medicines, now law. Cheaper childcare, now law. Getting wages moving, now law.
Order.
The climate change targets and the safeguard reforms, now law. Improved paid parental leave, now law. The National Reconstruction Fund, now law, with those opposite saying no.
Give a call. Order. Order. Members banging on desks is highly disorderly. The member for the Prime Minister has the call. Order. 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 Members on my left and right. I know it's the last day, but can everyone pause so I can hear from the Prime Minister?
Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
You give the call to the Leader of the House.
Just on indulgence, Mr Speaker. Sorry, I informed the Leader of the Opposition. On indulgence,
I'll call the Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to inform the House that on May the 6th I will attend, along with the Governor-General, the coronation of His Majesty King Charles III in London. Our nation will be represented at the historic event along with all of the state governors and a number of other notable Australians, most of which are based in the United Kingdom. Outstanding citizens have been chosen to show the world the best of our values, caring for others, serving community and championing progress. And I note that the Palace requested in particular that there be significant representation from Indigenous Australians as part of the coronation. There will be a holder of the Victoria Cross for Australia and another of the Cross of Valour will attend, as well as representatives of the Australian Defence Force. While in the UK, I will meet with Prime Minister Sunak to continue what have already been very productive discussions on defence and security cooperation, as well as trade and investment ties. I note that the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement received royal assent in the United Kingdom on the 23rd of March. This is an achievement both sides of this House have played a role in, and I'm sure all members will welcome the new jobs and opportunities this agreement will unlock. During the trip, I will also visit Barrow-in-Furness, which will play a key role in manufacturing the first AUKUS submarine, and will also be a source of great expertise and training opportunities for the next generation of Australian defence manufacturing. In addition to that, Mr Speaker, we will notify as soon as details are finalised. I've spoken with the Leader of the Opposition about the Quad Leaders meeting will take place in May. When those arrangements are finalised, we will, through you, Mr Speaker, and through the President of the Senate, give members and senators as much notice as possible for those arrangements. Thank you.
I'll just call the Leader of the House to deal with the, before we go to further questions, I understand to deal with the matters straight from the Senate.
Thanks, Speaker.
And then we'll deal with all other matters. Give the call to the Leader of the House.
To deal with this quickly, there's been an agreement. I've consulted with all sides of the chamber, so I won't speak to the motion. I'll simply move it. I move that so much of the standing and sessional orders be suspended as would prevent 1. The Speaker immediately reporting a message from the Senate in relation to the Safeguard Mechanism Crediting Amendment Bill 2023, and 2. The message being considered immediately and having priority over the discussion of the matter of public importance until its completion. So we then do the emperor.
The question is the motion be agreed to. I'll put the question. All those opinions say aye. Against no. I think the ayes have it. The following message from the Senate has been received. The Senate returns to the House of Representatives a bill for an act to amend legislation relating to admissions reductions and for related purposes, and informs the House that the Senate has agreed to the bill with amendments in the annex schedule. The Senate requests the concurrence of the House in the amendments. I'll give the call to the Minister.
Mr Speaker, I move that the amendments be considered immediately.
Yeah, I'll put the question. All of those opinions say aye. Against no. I think the ayes have it. I understand it is the wish of the House to consider the amendments together. Call the Minister.
I move the amendments be agreed to. Mr Speaker, agreeing to these amendments will enable the Safeguard Bill to become the law of Australia following royal assent. These are sensible amendments which are in